Welcome to Tales of Fae and Folk, and today I am going to tell you something a little different, and yet still an important part of our folk social history. Today I am going to tell you the tale of the last witches hung in England, the Bideford Witches. Many of us will have heard about the Lancashire witch trials or the Salem witch trials, the Bell Witch, and many other cases involving the persecution of women, men and even children branded as witches, subjects of gossip and malice and fear. People who lived on the edge of society were elderly, maybe a little cantankerous, a little bit weird. Healers and herbalists, anybody could be accused of witchcraft. It is believed between 500 and 1,000 people were killed as witches between the 15th and 18th centuries, and 90% of these were women. Devon in the southwest of England was one of the places that became a hotspot of witch accusations and persecution, especially in Exeter area. And although there are some fascinating folk tales of local witches with a basis in truth, today I am going to tell you an historical tale of what have become known as the last documented witches who were hanged in England, the Bideford Witches, and this is their sorry tale. The year was 1682, and a dreadful food shortage was overtaking the country. The witchcraft trials were starting to die out by now, but we still have to put ourselves mentally back into this time. A time of poverty, superstition and fear of the unknown, no real medical help, no social help, darkness lit by candles, tapers and the fireside glow, dirt or stone flags, or the floor strewn with countryside herbs or flowers when they had them. Food was simple, often for the poor it was meagre. Heat was from the day's hard graft and from open fires. The town that these women lived in was Bideford, a prosperous seaport on the north coast of Devon in the southwest of England. Bideford had had a terrible time just before the time of these witch trials. Social stress must have been horrendous. The English Civil War had seen brutal fighting in Bideford in the 1640s, brother against brother, families ripped apart in the battles between royalists and parliamentarians, a time of intense bloodshed, betrayal and grief, and this left a lasting legacy for generations on Bideford and the country as a whole. On top of this, in 1646 the plague came to Bideford, brought on a Spanish trading ship carrying wool. Children playing on the docks with the wool were its first victims. Plague devastated the community, burials over the 2 years numbering 229 souls, and for a town the size of Bideford, this would have rocked the community. And these stresses would play havoc on a community that would have been poor, hard-working, hard-drinking, taking a living from the sea and fields. Some would do well, very well, the merchants of course. The ports all around the coasts had wealthy merchants and traders, but we are looking at the regular people here, the working people, the sea workers and shopkeepers, those just trying to get along despite everything that came their way. Families that must have huddled together in the evenings around the fire, children grouped together in little beds for warmth against the damp, the men and women smoking clay pipes after a long day's work, drinking ale and telling stories, the women keeping the household ticking over, working out the daily meals and the budget, how to feed and keep warm the family, how to keep them safe against things far out of their control, and even how to protect their loved ones against enemies, both natural and supernatural. What we sometimes fail to realise in our modern time of instant light, heat and communication is the power of supernatural forces over the populations of these times. There was a real fear of fairies, witches, the devil, demons and ghosts. All of these things could prey on a home. A desperate need to understand illness in family or animals, loss and natural disasters, and a lack of scientific knowledge led to explanations of a supernatural manner. A family member had been cursed and fallen sick. A baby had been taken by fairies, and a weak changeling left in its place. The cow's milk now had blood. It must be a curse. The weather was unseasonably bitter, and the crows had warned of this. All of these things added to the burden of people with enough to cope with, and in this atmosphere the easiest to blame are those who are different, maybe a little odd, or those who are needed out of the way because of their inconvenience, their neediness on a society. And of course there were those who just accused others purely for their own ends, for their own gain of power and status. And gossip spreads. It becomes a thing of its own, twisting through the minds of those who just love to spread malice and cause panic and fear among the often gullible and the frightened. The echoes of this still are with us today when we look at our society. It seems to be a thing of human nature. And so back in Bideford on a Saturday in July in 1682, a local shopkeeper, Thomas Eastchurch, made a complaint to the local parish constables. These were law enforcement individuals who were part-time and voluntary, men chosen by the locals and appointed by local magistrates, and they had no choice but to use their time to carry out this work. Naturally, these people usually resented this extra burden. They had access to secure cells where to imprison people until a magistrate could hear a case. Also, pillories and stocks for local punishments were part of their care. Thomas Eastchurch made it known to them that one of the local women, Temperence Lloyd, had been practicing witchcraft. She was a friendless old woman with no one to vouch for her. The parish constables arrested the poor old woman and had her locked away in a chapel at the end of the old bridge. She would stay there until she could be questioned by the justices, who were the town mayor, Thomas Gist, and John Daly, a well-off local merchant, the following Monday. The charges read: suspicion of having used some magical art, sorcery or witchcraft upon the body of Grace Thomas, and to have had discourse or familiarity with the devil in the likeness or shape of a black man. The woman called Grace Thomas had a suspicion that Lloyd had harmed her. She was his sister-in-law and lived at the shopkeeper's home. Eastchurch's wife and another woman present during Grace Thomas's illness, Anne Wakely, were witnesses at the trial. They accused Temperence Lloyd of being regularly with the devil, who is described as a small, black creature with huge eyes, leaping around, both of them tormenting Grace Thomas, causing her pricking sensations about all of her body, or of having a grey cat that would harass the shopkeepers, of seeing the black creature suckling at the witch's teats of Temperence Lloyd, and that this devil would transform into a bird, sometimes a magpie, to also suckle at her. The evidence was rubbish, gossip and wicked stories, people saying they had heard Temperence Lloyd confessing to various dark things, of having caused the deaths of other people, of having a piece of leather that she would prick, causing harm on the knees of Grace Thomas, of having a doll figure that she had harmed and secreted in the Thomas's room, of being able to transform into a cat, and that she would visit Grace Thomas, and the invisible black creature would cause much pain to the bedridden woman. Thomas Eastchurch, shopkeeper, respected town gentleman, was another witness, again simply spreading lies about things he had overheard Temperance saying that she had done. Yet another witness, William Herbert, swore his father on his deathbed told him that he had been cursed by Temperance, and this was why he was dying. This had happened way back in 1671. On his father's death he had examined his father's body and found strange marks. At trial, Temperence Lloyd was, this time, acquitted. On the 3rd of July, Temperance was questioned by the justices. This poor old woman, friendless, obviously in a state of mental distress, possibly dementia. What could she do under the barrage of wealthy and respected Bideford accusers, and not being in her right mind? Temperance confessed to the charges, adding the day after the crime of causing the death of William Herbert, Lydia Berman, and Anne Fellow. She also confessed to blinding one of the eyes of Jane Dallin by pricking. Temperance Lloyd confessed all of this in the belief that the strange black creature would protect her from harm. On the 8th of July, Temperance Lloyd was sent to Exeter Prison to await her trial, and at this she confessed to her crimes. It was a travesty. Her mental state was in obvious collapse. The trials of Mary Trembles and Susanna Edwards. These two women, once again old, friendless, poor, widows, were considered a nuisance because of their constant begging for food at a time when there was a national shortage. A local woman called Grace Barnes reported them to the parish constables for their harassment of herself. As with the supposed victim of Temperance, Grace Barnes accused that she had been subject to pricking, pains, pinching sensations by Susanna and Mary. It was Grace Barnes' husband John who was the first witness. He had seen for himself the distress brought upon his wife by the women using witchcraft. He told of a confession he had overheard by Susanna of their wicked crimes. They were placed in the local cell and had to suffer the indignity of gawkers arriving to look at them. During the hearing that followed, a local man who had been sent, amongst others, to bring Grace Barnes to the court as a witness, and Anthony Jones, made the observation that Susanna wrung her hands in a strange manner while testimony was underway, at which she said, "Well enough, I will fit thee." As he led Barnes into the Guildhall where the trial was underway, he cried, "Wife, I am now bewitched by this devil," indicating Susanna. At this he began leaping around, throwing himself about, and finally he lay shaking and quivering and foaming at the mouth, eventually falling still for over half an hour. After this display, Grace Barnes did not even give her statement, but the justices turned straight to question Mary herself. Once again we see an elderly woman, not in her right mind at all, harassed, confused, the centre of attention, all eyes upon her. She confessed to it all, and yet she pointed the blame at Susanna Edwards for initiating her into the practice. Susanna followed. She too confessed, and also that she had been the tormentor of another woman, Dorcas Coleman. And that day's questioning came to an end. Next day, Wednesday the 19th, Anthony Jones was back at the Guildhall to give his statement about what happened to him during his perceived madness and fits the day before. Grace Barnes repeated her testimony and added that she was always suspicious of Susanna as the old woman would visit her home for no apparent reason or with some frivolous excuse. That same day, the two miserable old women had to suffer the dreadful act of being bodily searched for suspicious witch marks upon their naked bodies. After this, they were moved to Exeter Prison, where Temperence Lloyd was being held awaiting her trial. Once more we can read in John Watkins' book that the evidence was complete gossip, malicious rumour, and utterly fabricated. Even if some of the victims did believe they were under supernatural attack, there was actually no evidence that these women were guilty of anything, just a rather ridiculous confession after being treated so poorly. The majority of this evidence was from a William Edwards and a Joan Jones, both of whom only gave evidence of what they had apparently overheard. Edwards stated that on the 17th of July, Susanna had said that the devil had carnal knowledge of her body and that he had sucked her in her breast and in her secret parts, and further saith that he did hear her say that she and Mary Trembles did appear hand in hand invisible in John Barnes' house, where Grace, the wife of John Barnes, did lie in a very sad condition, and further saith that he did then also hear Susanna say that she and Mary Trembles were at that time come to make an end of her. Joan Jones said she had heard Susanna talking to a visitor, a John Dunning, who had travelled from the nearby market town of Great Torrington to speak to Susanna. He had asked how she had become a witch, and she had confessed that she had been approached by a man while collecting wood. She had gone with him in the hope that she might make some money. In her statement, Jones told that she had overheard the old woman confessing witchcraft to this visitor and then reported this to the justices. Once Dunning had left Susanna, Jones stated, Susanna had further spoken of going with Mary Trembles and the devil to the home of Grace Barnes to torment her. She had also heard Mary cry to Susanna that it was her fault that she had become a witch, and had spoken of the man in black who had come to Susanna, saying if she did as he told, she would want for nothing. When asked what did he want, he had simply disappeared. Joan's testimony got worse, that the devil carried Susanna's soul with him, that the devil in the shape of a boy suckled at her, that Susanna had carnal knowledge of the devil 4 times. Jones truly was an appalling piece of work. The 2 women were sent to Exeter to public trial to join Temperance, who they had known from years of begging on the streets of Bideford. And so Mary blamed Susanna for turning her to a witch. Susanna blamed Temperance for turning her to a witch. The public grew angrier and angrier at Temperence Lloyd. It was she who had corrupted the other 2. It is ridiculous. These women had no idea of what being a witch was. Their confessions of meeting the supposed devil are nothing, and yet the malice and cruelty shown by the townsfolk speaks of the real evil in these cases. At Exeter, the crowds were fascinated by the 3 women. Even miracles were attributed to them. Public hysteria was insane against these 3 old poor women. It was said by Roger North, brother of Lord North, who would sit as one of the court judges at the Exeter witchcraft trial, that the country people would have committed some disorder if the women were acquitted. They had no chance. On the 19th of August, the Exeter trial commenced, and as with witchcraft trials, it would be today considered a complete farce of hearsay, gossip. Not being near the accused crime was not even a defence. It was what we would call today trial by media, the braying crowds being the media. The judge, Sir Thomas Raymond, went with the will of the crowd, guilty of all charges. They had no chance. The 3 elderly women drifted between the belief that they were actually witches, exhausted resignation of their fate, and absolute sheer terror of what was happening. They themselves had admitted their guilt and had even added salacious testimony of their own. They, along with everyone else, had been caught up in the complete hysteria. The death penalty was written down, no reprieve on offer. The public this time were too dangerous themselves. As John Watkins says in his book, there was always some poor devil, either on account of an unlucky visage, sour temper, or wretched poverty, set up as the object of terror and universal hatred. To be honest, isn't this too many times the case today? The 3 women finally lost their lives on August 25th on 1682 at the gallows at Heavytree in Exeter. The presiding priest harangued them for their crimes that they had not actually committed, and finally they denied everything, but it was too late. After singing Psalm 40 at their own request, Susanna went first, then Mary, and finally Temperance. The sheriff asked her did she believe in Christ, and she simply replied, "Yes, and I pray Jesus Christ to pardon all my sins." In 1685, another Devon woman, Alice Molland, was sentenced to death at Exeter Assizes, but there is very little documentation regarding her case, and so these 3 women are known as the last 3 witches to be hanged in England. A plaque erected in the wall of Rougemont Castle in Exeter was mounted in memory of the injustices brought upon the lives of these Devon women. It can be viewed to this day. May Temperance, Mary, Susanna and Alice all rest in peace. I hope you have enjoyed this time's telling of tales. Once again, dear friends, take care, brightest of blessings, and remember, don't play with the fairy folk, or you may end up in one of my folk tales yourself.